They were gathered in Jerusalem for the feast of Pentecost. In Hebrew, the word is Shavuot. And Shavuot, at least as it's celebrated today, is a commemoration of the giving of the Torah by God to the people of Israel at Sinai. The idea, I think, is the invitation that moment in the life of ancient Israel, as it comes forward in time, is to constantly be aware of the fact that what defines one's life, here as a Jew, but what defines one's life is not just the commandments of God, because that's obviously what was given at Sinai, but rather what defines one's life in the world is God. Everything about God. The text that I always go back to when asked about who is God and or what is God is the text further into Exodus after the event of Sinai, where the Israelites are sick and tired of living in the desert, wandering around, lost, and they bitterly complain to Moses, and Moses doesn't know what to do and goes to God and says, God, you've got to give me more than just this. You've got to give me something to give to the people. And God says, I'm going to show you who I am. And you can just imagine the scene, but in any event, the text says, and God passes by Moses and is heard to say, a God of compassion, a God who is slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. As I hear that text and read that text, it challenges me to understand that living Torah, as what was given at Sinai, is not about observing commandments, but rather about a way of life in the world, with reference not to the world itself, but always with reference to God. In other words, we know even today that it'd be easy to live our lives with reference to the hate and the violence and the disruption of the world. But the way of Torah invites us to transform and change that reality into being slow to anger, rich in mercy, abounding in kindness, steadfast in love. So that who we are is defined by the essence of God's compassion and love and forgiveness and mercy, not by the hate and the violence and the prejudice and the anger of the world. That is really significantly different. So that the celebration of our Jewish brothers and sisters this weekend of Shavuot is an invitation, again, not to observe commandments, but rather to remember a way of life of being in the world. So that when we come to this scene, as Pat described it and as we heard it in the reading, that when we come to this scene, notice the scope of who's there. That it goes beyond just Jews, if you will, although we could assume that all those different places in the Roman Empire that are mentioned, that Jews from those places were coming to Jerusalem for this festival of Shavuot. But it also suggests that there were more than just those Jews. There were people of every race, nation, gender, sexual orientation, perhaps. That's what Peter says to them. You know, in those days, and the suggestion is that in those days is no longer in the future, but those days are now. This is the time now when this text from the prophet Joel is being fulfilled, that God is pouring out the Spirit, not just on Jews, but on all flesh, all people. All people are being gifted with something that God intended from the very beginning humanity to have. And here it's not just about gifts of the Spirit, but rather, again, it's God intends for us to live in the world with reference to not just a set of values, but with a reference to one another in such a way that we don't just value commandments, but we value the personhood of everyone else. Why? Because all flesh, all humanity, and all of the shapes and forms and colors and whatever else, that all humanity belong to God and are empowered by God to be human in the world. It's interesting. I just happened to think of a text that I often refer to when some of the nurses in my class talk about it in an evangelical Christian world, that the Christian nurse should be given witness and testimony to Jesus and speaking to the patient about Jesus and about connecting them to the body of Christ. And I go, oh my God, what if they're not Christian? What if they're atheists? What if they're, what do we do then? And so I say that the text comes from an ancient Christian writer in the 2nd century. He says, the glory of God is the human person fully alive. That's what matters. That it has nothing to do with preaching the gospel or teaching about Jesus or joining in membership to a church. It has to do with being fully alive. And the idea of that is that being fully alive is exactly what God is about in the world. To be the essence, the fullness, whatever it is, of our humanness in the world. So when they gather, what's interesting is three things about this reading, and I just heard the third one this morning that was a connection for me. Excuse me. So the first thing is the rushing of the wind. Now, the text is an obvious reference back to the story of Genesis, the beginning of creation. So that in that first verses of the book of Genesis, it said the earth was a formless void, an empty abyss, a dark abyss. And God breathes on creation, and out of that formless, empty, chaos and void, creation comes into being. The word in Hebrew in that text that gets translated breathing or breath is the word ruach, R-U-A-H. Now, here's what I want you to do, and those of you at home will have to do the same thing, all right? So that to get a full understanding of what this means is, put your hand in front of your face and pronounce ruach.
Ruach.
You see what happens? You breathe out, don't you? So that the word implies the breathing out, in Genesis, of breathing out life. Oh, wouldn't that be great if more of our speech would be breathing out life rather than breathing out what it often breathes out, right? So here's the second one, fire. You heard it in a couple of different ways. The scene in Exodus that connects us to Shavuot is the great scene where the Israelites are encamped around the foot of Sinai, and God's presence comes to Sinai, and there's flashes of lightning and peals of thunder and the smell of fire and sulfur in the air. That the visceral character of God's presence draws them into such a fashion that they cannot again see themselves in the same way that they've always done, that something powerful is happening in their midst, for them and to them and about them in this scene from Sinai. And you hear it again in the text from Peter and Joel, that God will send fire upon the earth. Now, you can take it in the strict apocalyptic sense of just wiping out civilization. This was used, I can't remember exactly the quote that Einstein, I believe it was Einstein, who, when he saw the effects of the atomic bomb that he had begun, it was like unleashing the fire of the end of the world. I mean, it was so fearful and anxious. But here, the sense has to do, and I tried looking it up, what's the Greek word for fire? And here, it's a philosophical question in some minds. Is the fire literally like a campfire that you put wood and you light it and it burns? Is it something more than that? It does have destructive powers, but it also has power to heat, to cook food, so that there are good and bad aspects of fire. And that's how it is. It's one of those things that you have to be very cautious and careful of how you use it, right? We see now in the midst of climate, the crisis that we have with the fires in our forest and that it's very, very destructive. But you know that one of the fascinating things about it is that certain pine trees, the only way and the only time they propagate is when there's a fire. Because the fire opens the pine cones and the seeds can go out to replenish the earth after the trees have been destroyed. Isn't that interesting? You see how in the midst of that. So the third one, maybe it's not anything that we remember, another biblical story that's being referenced in this. Did it sound familiar that all of the languages of the earth and all, did that sound familiar to anyone? Any idea where that reference is being made to?
Tower of Babel.
The Tower of Babel. And what happened at the Tower of Babel, if you remember the story? It said that they had become so proud of themselves that they were building this temple to touch God in the heavens, that they were so proud and self-centered and self-focused that God disperses them out onto the earth and divides and separates them by giving them different languages. What's happening in this story? It's a great reversal of that, isn't it? That now all of this great language diversity that does separate culturally people into groups, it's being brought back together again. That the brokenness of those scenes in the beginning of Genesis are being brought back into wholeness. The disciples, probably they didn't even know what they were saying, are speaking such that the other people with the other languages can speak to them. I often, when I've tried learning Spanish, I prayed to the Holy Spirit, could you give me just a little bit more ability to learn another language? So here's the point, here's the invitation, that if this story, seen in Acts, is drawing us back, as the celebration of Shavuot is drawing the Jewish community back to that moment when God gives them the Torah, which is, again, more than commandments, but rather an invitation to live a way of life in the world with reference to God, then the invitation here is that this mighty breathing of God and the fire that accompanies it is meant to burn in us, rest in us, such that we now become the agents and instruments of this vision of God for the world. That's what the reign of God was all about in Jesus' preaching. You now are the ones who take this message of transformation and change, this message of compassion and healing and acceptance and whatever it is, that this message of the reign of God, you now are the ones who take that message into the world. Jesus has left them. No, yes, no. Because the presence of God is now in each person. By the way, that means not even Christians possess it all. In Buddhists, in Hindus, agnostics and Baha'i and whoever else, atheists, that God's presence, and by the way, you don't even have to recognize this. By you being fully human, you have it. It's being witnessed to. So the challenge then, and you hear it, we're back in the gospel. We've come full circle from Easter. That was the text from Easter Sunday. That Jesus comes again into the midst of their fear and anxiety. That they close themselves off from the world. And Jesus enters into that. Notice, he doesn't stand in accusation of them. You turned your back on me. He says instead, peace, shalom. This is the gift. Again, I have to think, he doesn't accuse them. Rather, he invites them out of that enclosure of fear, out into an openness to be touched themselves by the shalom of God, but also now to be the instruments of shalom for the world. Peace I give you. What you do in the world, here's the catch, what you do in the world now is to reflect who God is in the world. That said, to those who now have completed their time of mystagogia, that said to them, you've done this, you've learned more, now be who you're supposed to be who you're meant to be. It's interesting, I did a little, if I can take just a couple more minutes. You know, within 10 years, if we take 33 AD as the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, and really all of these events that we talked about here in Pentecost, within 10 years, Paul has gone out from his encounter with Pentecost in his conversion experience. Within 10 years, he has founded communities of disciples all along the Aegean coast of modern-day Turkey and in several places in Greece. Within another 20 years, by 70 AD, when the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem has occurred, there are already Christian communities in Rome, in Alexandria. Within another 20 years, into the early 100s, there are now Christian communities in France, in Germany, perhaps even in modern-day England. Within 50 years of this event, there are already Christian communities throughout the Roman Empire. Within another 100 years, in spite of the persecutions, in spite of the harshness of Roman rule and oppression of Roman law, there are Christian communities all over the Mediterranean. But be careful. If you walked down the street in a Roman city, you wouldn't see a church. You wouldn't see a sign saying Christian Church, Chalice Christian Church, Baptist Church. Wouldn't see a sign. Because there wouldn't be any churches, buildings. You'd have to look into the homes of those who were not disciples. The first church, for almost 300 years, didn't meet in buildings like this. They met in people's homes. And by the way, how they did their supper was around a regular dinner table. And by the way, who led that meal was whoever was head of the household. Meaning, some homes may have had women who were heads of households. And women led the service. I'm having a discussion on Facebook with some of my friends who, both in the Anglican Church and in the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, who are insisting that communion should only be for those who are members of the church. And oh, by the way, it should be led by an ordained minister, because I shared with them what we do here. I said, you know what it's like to be an ordained minister, to sit in the chair as the elders, the lay people say the words of Jesus. I said, you know what? That's how it was. They didn't have ordained ministers to lead services. They had whoever was the head of the household lead the service. Women and men did it. They didn't need 4-year seminary degrees. They didn't need church buildings. It's not until after Constantine that they feel compelled to become like the empire. There's where things begin to go awry. The invitation then, as Jim suggested at the beginning, is here we are, Chalice, at this moment in time, when we were on the verge of leaving this place to another place. Here we are now, back here. So here's the thought. Listen again to that text in Corinthians. The manifestation of the Spirit comes to all of us. That means even the youngest members of our community have gifts to share with us. That the oldest members of our community have gifts to share with us. That we share the gifts from those present in person, those present on Zoom. We have all have gifts to share. Maybe a part of the task right now for us is to spend some time discerning what those gifts are. How we discern will say something about how we're going to make use of them. Maybe you've done that already, fantastic, but it's something that continually needs to happen, discernment of our gifts and skills and talents. But remember, it's not for the church. It's for the world, for the community in the world. I want to say this, it's interesting. I use the word church. In Greek, the word in the text is ekklesia. There's your $75 theological word for the day. Try that on somebody at the grocery store when you go to check out. Oh, what ecclesia do you belong to? And just see the response that you might get. The word ecclesia means literally ek, out, klesia, to call out. But it was a technical word used in the Greek world for the assembly of the freeborn members of the community. So that when important decisions needed to be made for the community, they would call the ecclesia together. And there, in an open conversation, dialogue, questions, information sharing, whatever it might be, using very modern terms, that the ecclesia would then voice approval or disapproval of where the leaders wanted to take the community. So ecclesia means the assembly, people. It's interesting, I found out this morning that the Quakers refused to name their church, their buildings that they met in, churches. They called them steeple houses, meaning how they looked, I suppose. Because to them, to call their gathering space a church was against what the scripture invited them to consider as an assembly of people. It's about people. So here we are as Chalice at this moment in time when maybe this is a time for the new Pentecost for us. A new Pentecost that transcends the building that we're in into the world in such places that maybe in our own homes we can be the gathered assembly of people. Maybe each time that you gather as individual family or invite other families in, that becomes an ecclesia that bears witness and gives testimony to the power of God's presence of being slow to anger, rich in mercy, steadfast in kindness, loving presence. Maybe in our own homes that we can be Chalice rather than in a building. Maybe in the way that we do the work that we do as lawyers, as doctors, as retired people, as teachers, as students, wherever we are, that we're doing this work of connecting, reconnecting, recreating, breathing life, bearing witness to the passion of our lives in God, the fire of that passion of transforming and changing the world, of making a difference, of leading our lives as a way of life in God, in the reign of God, to bear witness and give testimony to the reign of God, to the shalom of God. Well, a lot more to say and a lot more that will have to follow. Again, peace, peace I give you. Not as the world gives it, but as God gives it. That's the gift given to us today, is the shalom of God, that like a mighty breath of wind giving life, and as a fire of passion that we take into the world to bring that gift of God.